So, why is nobody afraid of car accidents? It's a legitimate question because when you look at statistics, car accidents are probably the most likely way for somebody to die before old age, with the possible exception of getting injected with the thing that is supposed to help the other thing. I can't really talk about it without being censored, but I think you guys know what I'm referring to. But with the exception of the thing, I would say right now in our society today, driving or being hit by a car is your most likely premature cause of death. Much higher than being murdered, which a lot of people on both the left and the right are scared shitless of. Right wingers are more afraid of like gangsta or homeless crime, whereas left wingers are afraid of like hate crime or mass shootings by incels. But regardless of what type of murder you're afraid of, most people are scared shitless of murder, but have very little fear, if any, of dying or being injured in a car accident or being hit by a car as a pedestrian or any combination thereof. I mean, even myself, like I had a dream last night about being on the streets of New Orleans and witnessing a murder there. I was in New Orleans recently, by the way, but yeah, in this nightmare, I witnessed a black guy shoot another black guy in the head, and then I was running for my life to get away from him because then he was following me and trying to kill me also. So it's like, okay, why do I have these nightmares? This isn't the first time. Like, I've had plenty of nightmares about being murdered, mostly by, like, gangsta thug types. And it's like, okay, so why do I have these nightmares, but I never have nightmares about dying in a car accident, even though statistically it's far more likely to happen? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Firstly, it's because car accidents aren't politicized in the same way violence is, or other things that people are afraid of, be it, the thing that I was referring to, and also the thing that the thing is a response to, both of those things. The thing you're injected with, and also the thing that is the reason why you're injected with it. Those things, like both sides of the political spectrum, well, each one is more afraid of the original thing, the other is more afraid of the thing that is supposed to be the cure to the thing. Both sides of the political spectrum have been very afraid of those things. Also, any kind of violence, as I mentioned, whether it be crime or sexual violence or mass shootings or whatever. Also, like terrorism is another big one. So, like, those things, I think the reason why people are more afraid of them is because they're more politicized. Whereas car accidents are less politicized. The only people who really politicize them are like the really die-hard public transit advocates. And like, I participate in those online communities sometimes, but like, they're not really that much of a thing in the real world. They're more like kind of a subculture that's largely confined to the internet, and you don't hear those types of opinions expressed very much in like mainstream circles. It's very much a niche opinion. And you also don't see the mass media fear mongering about car accidents. You see them fear mongering plenty about people getting assaulted or killed on public transit in Toronto in particular, and also in other places. You do not see them ever really hyping up car accidents. And is it, again, it's a chicken or the egg thing. It's like, does the media not report on it because people don't read or listen to these stories? Or do people not care about these stories because the media doesn't report on it enough or make a big enough deal of it? It's definitely one of those chicken or the egg things. Like, is it top down or is it bottom up? Do people not care because the media doesn't want you to care? Or does the media not report on it because people don't care? It's hard to say, but regardless of what it is, the media definitely doesn't hype it up as much, be it the left-wing media or the right-wing media or even the ostensibly centrist or neutral media outlets, fair and balanced, whatever the fuck. Yeah, they just don't report on it that much. So I think that's a thing that like people treat it. It's like the Joker says, it's part of the plan. Like 12, like. Uh, 120 people die in car accidents every year and nobody cares. but there's a mass shooting and 5 people die and everyone loses their minds. It's kind of like that. And it's very true in that particular case. Like, it's part of the plan and people don't care. That's part of it. But I also think it could go deeper than that. I actually think it could have to do with kind of just an inherent flaw in the human brain. Like, for whatever reason, we are evolved to see certain things as threats because they've been threats to us for all of history. Like, murder has been present in humanity and human nature since the beginning of time. However, car accidents are actually a relatively new thing in terms of the entire scope of human biology. Cars have only existed for like slightly over 100 years. So maybe we're just not evolved yet to really fear car accidents as much as we should, which is why I don't have nightmares about car accidents, but I do have nightmares about being murdered. That could be part of it, although it raises the question, well, what about like horse accidents, like horse and carriage accidents? People had those for many years. I don't know. Like, I mean, fair enough. How many centuries have humans been using horses for? I don't know, but like, it's hard to say, like, to what extent does the ancestral memory of falling off horses translate into nightmares today about car accidents? I don't know, maybe it's just less translatable. Whereas the fear of being murdered is something that has existed from the caveman days all the way till today. The murder weapons are all that have changed. So I guess that could be it. But either way, it is very fascinating because when seeing, like, for instance, the response to TTC violence, like, I think something like 3 people have been murdered in random attacks on the TTC in the last few years. It's like, okay, how many people died in car accidents in Toronto in the same period of time? Probably dozens or hundreds. But the media just doesn't hype that up as much. And yeah, obviously you have to take into account other things too, like injuries. Like, a lot more people have been injured in these TTC attacks or like been threatened with death but survived. But it's like, okay, then you also have to compare that to like people who are injured in car accidents or who narrowly miss potentially fatal car accidents. Like, I've never been in like a car accident where I was injured, but I've narrowly missed numerous ones where I could have been killed. One was caused by a fucking elk in the middle of the road, but others were just caused by like bad driving on behalf of various people, perhaps myself, perhaps the others. But that's the thing, you can't control the other drivers no matter how good a driver you are. And that's another thing, like, people, the interesting thing is with stuff like crime or murder, people are willing to alter their behavior to like reduce the chance of being victimized, but they act like car accidents are a force of nature. That's another thing. Like, this attitude that like car accidents are a totally random thing, they're a force of nature, you can't avoid it, so it's just a reality you have to accept. But it's like, that's not entirely true. Because it's like, you could choose to use public transit rather than driving, or you could take certain precautions while driving. Like, for instance, avoid driving at night. Specifically, avoid driving Friday and Saturday nights, because that's like statistically the most dangerous time. It's also, I think, the most dangerous time in terms of crime as well. So there you go. It's just the most dangerous time in general. Probably avoid like driving on certain types of roads, like stroads. Especially stop making left turns on them when it's like unprotected left turns. Those are like really fucking dangerous. Like, unprotected left turns onto like multi-lane arterial roads are just inherently fucking dangerous. I would recommend not doing it. What else? Like, also, as a pedestrian, there are steps you can take. Like, again, avoid walking around at night, wear bright clothing. Also, avoid walking along stroads, like big arterial roads. Like, try to walk on side streets wherever possible, rather than these like big ass arterial roads where people are driving fast. Because even if you're on the sidewalk, you're still in more danger on these roads than you are on a side street where people are driving at far lower speeds. So, like, yeah, I mean, there are things you can do to mitigate it. And this idea that it's just a force of nature, I don't think is entirely true. and that it's something that's completely unavoidable. Also, fucking like drive if people just drove better, and that's another thing. If we change the laws to be like lower some of the speed limits, for instance, or change the design of our roads to make them less conducive toward people driving like maniacs. But again, people refuse to do that. And it's part of the reason why there's fewer car accidents in countries like Sweden, because they do actually design their roads more with safety in mind, whereas we do design our roads more with speed in mind. So it's like, again, like design is also a huge factor in reducing car accidents, but nobody wants to talk about that. The massive cope is like, oh, car accidents are a force of nature. They're a totally random force of nature that cannot be controlled or prevented. And it's like, okay, whatever. I mean, again, like people don't view murder that way. They don't view mass shootings that way. They don't view terrorism that way, but they do view car accidents that way, which honestly isn't true. It's not true in any of these cases. Like pretty much everything has causes behind it. I mean, even forces of nature have causes behind them. Like some places you're more likely to have an earthquake because you're on a fault line. Some places you're more likely to have a hurricane. I mean, how many things are there that are really totally random? I mean, I'm sure there's some, like getting hit by an asteroid or something like that, but like very few things are totally random. Or I guess like having a brain aneurysm, something like that. Like there are some things that are totally random, but most dangers generally are not. Car accidents included. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that entire subject. Oh, and one other point I just remembered. Where you live does affect your chance of getting in a car accident, whether as a driver or a pedestrian. It does actually matter where you live. Some places have worse car accidents than others. I would say places that are worse, rural areas tend to be worse. Actually, places with the same vibrant demographics that commit crimes also tend to be worse. But I think actually rural areas overall tend to be the worst. Like I think the places that have the highest per capita rates are like Wyoming and other states like that. So but but when they break it down more according to demographic, there's also like the usual suspects are actually it's not Asians, interestingly enough. Like the stereotype is that they're the worst drivers. Actually, no, it's the usual suspects, I believe. So yeah, it's a bit complicated. Where are the more dangerous places for driving? It seems to be actually in the U.S. at least, southern states seem to be worse, and also the inland west, like Wyoming and states like that. And the ones that are less bad tend to be the more urbanized coastal states, like in the Northeast or say California, Washington, Oregon. So and yeah, it seems I think red states are generally worse than blue states overall for car accidents, for fatal car accidents. So I mean, and on a country level, absolutely. Like the worst countries in the world, I think, tend to be Africa and Latin America, which are also the worst for homicides. Go figure, right? Um, and on a world scale, again, like with homicides, the U.S. is worse than Europe, especially worse than Western Europe. So yeah, there's some parallels there, but also some curveballs because like states like Wyoming, they don't have a high homicide rate, but they do have a high car accident fatality rate. So I think there's a lot of factors going on here, but there does seem to be a link to certain things like lower population density, more car dependence, but at the same time, vibrancy is also a link that throws somewhat of a curveball there. So it's like there's a few factors going on. I mean, you can look at the statistics yourself. That's the thing. Nobody looks at these statistics. Everybody looks at like crime statistics, mass shooting statistics, terrorism statistics. Nobody's looking at the fucking car accident statistics, so nobody knows what's going on there, you know? Like it would help to identify patterns if anybody other than me was actually looking at this stuff. But yeah, those are my observations there. So, yeah.